Hi, everybody. Steve Cady here at Bowling Green State University with our Doctorate in Organization Development and Change program. This is our Symposia series, and we have a program of thought leader development in our doctorate program, people that are on the mission to go out and take their knowledge, advanced knowledge, and bring it out into the world to help transform organizations, revitalize communities, and develop human potential. And they're doing some amazing work. Our program has people from all over the country as well as outside of our country coming in. We have people in all different industries and perspectives, and publishing already on all kinds of great topics. And I'm just super proud of our program, our students, and the work that we're doing. The Symposia series is intended to bring and highlight the great work of our students, our partners in the community and the field, such as Barry. So we're really glad to have you here today, Barry. It's nice to have you coming in and connecting with us. Your work resonates. Herb is a particular fan of your work. He's been really digging into that as he's doing his research and his writing, and others, me included, really find it to be a very elegant way to address and move on critical issues. So thank you for your contributions, Barry. And I'll turn it over to you and enjoy the time with you today. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it. And welcome, everyone. Merry Christmas, a holiday season. Happy Hanukkah. And let me get started here. I'm just going to share my screen. And so what we, can everybody see the screen here? I just want to make sure I'm broadcasting. You can see it?
Yes, yep, we can see it.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Thank you. So the primary focus is going to be on how a polarity lens addresses racism and climate change. It will primarily focus on poverty, racism, and sexism, with just a parallel note on climate change, because what I'm going to be doing is talking about how a polarity lens is helpful. It's a paradoxical change model in which it assumes that from a polarity perspective, if you want to embrace the upside of the other pole of a polarity, and you're in the downside of one pole and you want to embrace the upside of the other pole, that a gap analysis change model gets in the way. It doesn't help you. And your efforts to get to the upside of the other pole gets resisted by an either or mindset that believes that if you're going to go to the other pole, you're going to let go of the original pole. And so we're going to look at how that either or mindset is a root cause and perpetuator of poverty, racism, and sexism, and what we can do about it, which is essentially to add or thinking. So again, a reminder of our mission at Polarity Partnerships is to enhance our quality of life on the planet by supplementing or thinking with and thinking. We're not replacing it, we're supplementing it. So or thinking is essential in basic problem solving, but it doesn't serve us well to use or thinking and basic problem solving or typical gap analysis if we are dealing with a polarity. So the outcomes of this is to brief understanding of the small process for leveraging polarities, what that is and how that works. And we had just a brief experience with the polarity assessment, and I just wanted to have you experience it to understand its utility. We won't take long with it, but I wanted you to just be aware that you can assess any polarity with any size organization once you have identified that polarity. And finally, understanding how or with and helps us address poverty, racism, sexism, and climate change. So a brief introduction: polarities are interdependent pairs, also known as paradox, dilemma, or tensions in the literature. They're energy systems in which we live and work. It's important to appreciate that there's a lot of power within a polarity, within that social energy system. Why bother? It will help you effectively lead in turbulent times, and it'll help you deal with tensions in systems, with resistance to change, which is going to be the primary focus here, and with polarization. So those are the primary areas where it can help. And we have a 5-step process for addressing a polarity. The first, so the 5 steps is the acronym SMALL. And we say, focus on small in order to go big. And the S stands for seeing. the first step is to make the distinction between in this issue, in this struggle we're dealing with in our organization, in this change effort we're trying to make, is the difficulty we're experiencing or the excitement we're riding, is it sitting primarily in a problem to solve, or is it primarily sitting in a polarity to leverage? If it is a polarity to leverage, then we need to map it and understand, well, what are the upsides and downsides of the pole? What might be our greater purpose? Once we've mapped any polarity, we can assess it. How well are we doing at getting both upsides, maximizing both upsides and minimizing the downsides? We take the assessment, we learn from that assessment. Okay, what are the results? What does that tell us? And then we can leverage. And we leverage a polarity by generating action steps to support each upside and by identifying early warnings that will let us know early if we're getting into the downside of one pole or the other. So in all of those steps, we need to engage key stakeholders. So we engage them in seeing the polarities in the first place. We engage them in identifying the map, creating the assessment, learning from the assessment, and then what are the action steps and early warnings. So in every step of the way, we like to engage key stakeholders. So I'm going to give you a quick look at assessment results around the assessment of polarity and change. So let me see here. What I have to do is I've got to stop sharing a second and go down here and get the assessment results. Let me see, I could share screen again and go to assessment results now. Okay, so can everybody see these results? If somebody can answer.
Yes. Yep, we see them.
Okay, thank you. So again, I'm going to do this rather quickly because often when we tell people that you can assess a polarity, they have a bunch of questions about the assessment. Can you assess if somebody doesn't know anything about polarities? How long does it take, etc. So I asked you to just fill out a simple assessment around stability and change here. And I just want to run through now and show you what's possible with this. So you can create demographic groups, as much demographics as you want. In this, we just looked at age as a demographic. And if you'll notice, about half the group is 50 or younger and half are 50 or older. We also just looked at some professional breakdowns, and you can see this breakdown. If you click on it, you can see how many there are. Business and industry, there's 5. Education administration, there's 3. Teaching, consulting, 2. Gender, 3 options, male, female, or choose not to respond. So I just grabbed those 3 so that we could take a look at a couple of demographic comparisons to show you how that works. So if we look here at the polarity summary, you'll notice on the left here, we've got this danger zone, and then there's being in a risky space, and then there's good to great. So, and in this case, the average of what 13 people responded to is a 57. Which is in that risky space. So we would definitely, a lot of room for improvement here. And so let's look at how that breaks out. So we have the polarity map here with, and I'm just going to simplify it a little bit. So the first thing we're paying attention to is the desire to stay the same or the desire to change. So stability and change is the polarity. And then what we're looking for is, as you'll notice in this left quadrant, it's you're looking for, in response to the questions, you'd like to almost always be in each upside in terms of the frequency. You'd almost always like to be having those benefits. That's why this sample infinity loop shows the optimal that you could have. Also here, you want to almost always get the upside of this pole. And notice the arrangement of frequency is switched here. So you want to almost never be in the downsides, almost never. And the scores go 0, 25, 50, 75, and 100 is what you get for each of these quadrants. So you'd like to be 100 on each of these, almost always in each upside, and 100 here, almost ever in each downside. And that would lead to a net score of 100. So now if we're just going to add, here are the items. There were 3 questions for each quadrant that you were taking. And so if we look here at the upper left quadrant, some positive results from stability is we value the tried and true solutions we've been using. We have clear and or understood ways of getting our work done, and we hold on to business processes that we are confident will support us in achieving our current future needs. The upside then of desire to change, we welcome solutions that keep us on the leading edge. We're open to new and or improved ways of working, and our drive to adopt best practices is grounded in the realities of our current and future business needs. And then we have the opposite down below. So that's this now. Now here's the loop that showed up in terms of the average results here. And quickly, we notice what here we've got is a 66 here and a 58 here. So slightly stronger, the average is slightly stronger for getting the benefits of stability in this system. It's between sometimes and often. And here, it's also between sometimes and often, but you'd like to be often getting these upsides minimally. So that would be 75 would be an average of, if you had 75 would be often. You'd like to have 75 or above. And here, we look at here, in terms of the downside, notice we've got a 45 here. So this is, on average, the systems that you were thinking of, the 13 who stated this, are getting more benefits of stability than they are from change. And they're also extremely more vulnerable here. So they're getting a lot of downsides of stability. And so the desire here for this organization would be, how could we improve some of these benefits of stability and pay attention to what we can do to maximize these upsides? And there's different ways we can show these results. We can break them out by individual score. So you can see, and the color lets you know whether you're in that good to great category or in that danger category, or if you're in real trouble, which shows up as a red. And this is the one statement where the score is very problematic. We are generally resistant to the idea of change, and that got a stronger score. Then you can also share them out in terms of by that which you got the highest score and that which you got the lowest score. And then what you can do is you can go down and look at action steps and early warnings. And sometimes we have those already built in that you can compare and contrast. So let me do one more just quick thing with this so that you can see how you can play with them really quickly. So let's say we want to add a demographic group. And so let's take for one demographic group, we'll have female, we'll add that group. And then we're going to add another group here to the demographic. And you can do any combination of these that you want, but I'm just going to grab these because I noticed there was a little bit of thematic difference between the two. I was checking this out just a little bit earlier this morning. So now what happens is you can see that they aren't that different between men and women, but you can see a little bit of difference in these scores. Notice how they break out. You've got the average score, and then you've got female or male. And in most cases, women are tending to score things higher than the men are in this system. Now we could check out as to why that is or why not. It's not a real significant thing, but it is, this is a difference between 50 and 25 on this one. We are generally resistant to the idea of change. Men tend to, of the men participating here, tend to see that as more of a problem than the women do, for example. And you can break this out, by all sorts of groups. Now you can see the scoring for each one of these and see the comparison between the average and then the women and the men, because we broke it out that way, and get the results. And so with every one of these, you can see, okay, how does that look in the question? So you could break out demographic groups, or if you were working with a community, you could, I'm just going to stop sharing here a second. What you can do is, let me go back here and share screen now, because I think that gives me a chance to, yeah, okay. So can you see that now, the presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So are there, maybe we could take just a brief moment to see if there are any questions about that. Then I would like to move on to just a question or two about the assessment. Anything in
It's
the,
Michelle Bradke, and I'm wondering, and no one else on the call will be surprised, but how were your categories developed?
in terms of demographics?
No, in terms of the yellow, orange, or red groupings, how
Oh.
did you determine the score that would be a danger score, your methodology?
We just looked at a history of the work we had done with organizations, and so in one sense it's relatively arbitrary in terms of what organizations experienced it as really problematic or not, and so those numbers seem to correspond with clients' assessments of what would they give to that category, how would they see it when we looked at the results. So we got results before we put those categories in place. So they came from a series of assessments that we've been doing these assessments, by the way, working on this assessment process since 1994, and it keeps evolving. So that's where it came from.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let me shift into this next section then. What I'd like to talk about now is there are going to be two chapters from And Volume 1, the Foundations book on polarity thinking, and there'll be chapter 29 and 30. And so the story about this chapter starts with Dr. Victor Garcia at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. He was the founder of the Trauma Center for Cincinnati Children's Hospital. And Cincinnati Children's Hospital is located in the Avondale neighborhood of Cincinnati, which is one of the most violent neighborhoods. I think it is the most violent neighborhood in Cincinnati. And so what Dr. Garcia was seeing coming into the Trauma Center was a lot of children, since the Children's Hospital, were coming in with wounds, knife wounds, gun wounds, and he got really, obviously concerned about and taking care of these children coming through. And one of them was China. And China was 8 years old at the time. And she was walking in the neighborhood with a man who was a target of a drive-by shooting. The result of him being shot at was that she got her eye shot out and got paralyzed from the waist down. So China is just one example of Dr. Garcia's concern. He said, these children keep coming, I keep operating on them. Of course, we have to do that. But the fact is that China is a symptom of something. What I'd like to do is not just be dealing with the symptoms, these kids that are coming through impacted by gun shootings, et cetera, but I'd like to get at the root cause. How can we somehow reduce the number of kids coming through with gunshot wounds and deal at the community level? And so he created an organization called Core Change, which was an effort to change the communities so they were safer, so there were less of these happening. And part of that process was he came to an organization development change conference, and he spoke there about his concern for help and getting a systems perspective to reduce violence in the neighborhood in Cincinnati. So he realized that focusing on symptoms alone is not enough. So he wanted to look at root causes. So as we got into exploring this, since he and I were both at this conference, we got in a conversation, and he invited me to come with him and to do some work with him in Cincinnati, which we did, and we did a mastery program there in Cincinnati. And out of that exploration was part of where this showed up, was in that work in Cincinnati. So we've got symptoms and we've got root causes. And part of the things that we were noticing was that you could see 8-year-old China being shot as a symptom. And you might say, well, what's the root cause behind that? So the first thing is, well, the poverty and racism within the Avondale neighborhood where she lives could be seen as a root cause. But then that begged the question, what if poverty and racism was seen as a symptom of something we needed to go further, go deeper into this and understand? They could say, well, we could look at systemic institutional policies and practices, that lead to poverty and racism. How do we address systemic racism and institutional policies and practices? But what happens if we look at systemic institutional policies and practices as also a symptom? Then where do we go underneath that? Excuse me. So often what we do is we look for an evil source or a bad or evil source. So now we say, well, these are evil people who are creating these evil systems, these bad systems, and creating these policies and practices. And so we try to find an evil source. And my suggestion is that looking for an evil source is not helpful. In other words, looking for a group that is inherently evil. And so what happens is when you start to look for an evil source, it ends up becoming some version of us or them. And this gets to blaming and projecting on other people, stuff we can't own. So it's easy for me to not own my own racism and find somebody else to blame for systemic racism without owning my own. So we get into this us and them projection. But what if there's an alternative? Maybe there's an alternative source to systemic institutional policies and practices. And I'm suggesting that alternative source is or thinking without and thinking. So what I'm suggesting is there are 4 positive desires that we all have. We grow up with them. They're inherent to our culture, any culture in the world. They're inherent to our culture and they're positive. One of them is the desire to be clear and a decisive problem solver. If we got problems, it's helpful to be a problem solver. The desire to protect my family or my organization or my country. The desire to provide for my family or organization or country. And this usually gets focused on us, whatever's my group, my country, my organization. So to be clear, to protect and provide, also to belong. I want to belong within a group, and that group becomes us, my family. I want to belong to my family, my community, my organization, etc. So when there are power differences, the dominant group's desires win over marginalized groups. So when we look at power being brought to these 4 desires, it shows up as systemic disparities that reinforce bias and inequity. So this is how it works. Pay attention to these 4 desires. Now, from a polarity perspective, by the way, final point here is that the systemic disparities that reinforce bias and inequity, that contributes to the creation and perpetuation of sexism, racism, and poverty. So for example, there's going to be these 4 polarities that I think I'm stacking them. So we're looking at how they combine with each other. So the first one is or thinking and thinking. The next one is claiming power for us and sharing power with them. Another one is freedom and equality. And the final one is justice and mercy. And what I'm suggesting happens is that we tend to focus on or thinking initially. That's the source, the original source here is we tend to focus on or thinking. And we come by or thinking naturally. It is about solving problems. So or thinking and being a problem solver is an upside of or thinking. So that's an important benefit. Now, claiming power for us and sharing power, if we see it from an or perspective, the claiming power for us is important because it helps us protect us. We need adequate power to protect our family, et cetera, from harm. So protection becomes an important thing. The next value is around freedom. Freedom to provide, to take initiative, to work hard, to generate income, to provide for my family, or to provide, organization to provide. And finally, justice. We focus on justice. We obey laws in order to belong. You know, if you want to belong in this organization, then you need to obey the rules. And so we obey the rules in order to gain membership. So notice how these four things now fit as the upside of four poles of polarity. What's missing, all of these are great things, but without their partner, they become dysfunctional. So or without and becomes dysfunctional. Claiming power without sharing power becomes dysfunctional. Freedom without equality does, and so does justice without mercy. So what's missing in this stack is the benefits of the other pole. So let's just walk through these for a second. So or thinking without and thinking. We already know that or thinking without and thinking leads to vicious cycles as we fight between two poles when they're interdependent. So that leads to vicious cycles. So we've talked about that in previous sessions. So I want to just go to the next one here, which is claiming power for us or sharing power with them. And so when we choose, and this is often unconscious, when we arrive with or thinking as our preference or our predisposed orientation, our unconscious bias for or thinking, when we bring that or thinking to the look at claiming power and sharing power, it sets up a real issue for us in that we then look at this as an or issue. So when we look at this from an or perspective, it looks like this. We want the upside of claiming power, so we have the power to protect our interests. And we want to avoid, with or thinking, it's like, are we going to have the power to protect, or are we going to be defeated and unable to protect our interests? So we're going to be oppressed or seen as inferior. So the fear of the downside of sharing power and the desire for the value of holding on to the upside of claiming power to protect, that leads to an overfocus on claiming power for us, to the neglect of sharing power with them because we don't think we can do it. It would mean a loss of power because power is a zero-sum game. So when we bring or thinking to this, what ends up is we lose the benefits of sharing power with them, which is they have the power to protect their interests. When we lose that, it looks like this. They are defeated and unable to protect their interests. So what happens is we have military superiority leads to assumptions of superiority in all other ways. This includes male superiority, white superiority, rich superiority, and that gets to sexism, racism, and poverty. So, for example, in the United States, when my ancestors came from Europe and started occupying North America, we were militarily superior, which allowed us to take land from Native Americans, also allowed us to take in people who were free in Africa, put in chains, arrive in chains, and we had power over them. So we took the lands from Native people and we created plantations on which we used slave labor, and we had the power over both. But the military superiority that allowed us to take the land and have power over people of color resulted in us assuming superiority in other ways as well. So why did we win? Because we're smarter, because we're more frugal, because God's on our side. We can give all sorts of attributes to the reason for our superiority militarily that assumes superiority in all other ways. So that's where white supremacy comes from, if you will, and male supremacy. So that leads to them being defeated and treated as inferior, whoever they are. In this case, the United States, it would be Native Americans and other people of color and women, and they get seen as inferior. So now we continue to bring that or thinking. Now we're on top in terms of we have military power and control, and we have this or thinking mindset. We bring that to the notion of freedom and equality, and let's look at that one. So when we look at freedom and equality, the upside of freedom is I can provide for myself and my family and my organization. This is entrepreneurial initiative, going ahead, the upsides of capitalism. And I can create abundance for some. What do I mean for abundance? I mean, talking about abundance of healthcare, education, jobs, food, water, shelter, and safety. So, but if I look at abundance for some with an or mindset, then I can neglect our needs and my family and organization's needs. And what happens is we lose our abundance. So the either or mindset again here leads for me going after abundance for my family or my organization. And what gets lost is the basics for all. And that leads to neglect for the basic needs for them, and inequality. So this leads to gross inequality, right? So what we have with this focus, we end up is they lose the basics. Again, they being people who are marginalized end up losing the basics. And finally, we look at justice and mercy. On the justice side, we obey the law, we stand up, we use laws to protect and provide. But if we look at the downside of mercy, it's the opposite of obeying the laws. There's inaction in the name of forgiveness. Lawlessness is tolerated. We cannot protect and provide. And those who embody mercy are seen as less than. So now we look at moving towards justice. If we do that to the neglect of mercy, what we lose is the ability to forgive, to understand, and use forgiveness to heal self and others and relationships. And that leads to this downside. The laws are used to maintain power, slavery, Jim Crow, and the new Jim Crow. And many laws and harsh punishments lead to projection by those with more power on those with less power. So whatever I can't own as my fault, as my doing, I project on others. And so we project on, for example, Native Americans and people of color. We can project laziness on them, and in order to consider ourselves to be industrious. And we can claim again our superiority over them and project things we don't want to own onto them. So that's the final straw in this combination, and it leads to our cruelty to them. And our cruelty is done. Our dehumanizing of slaves, for example, gets legitimated by dehumanizing them, by having them be less than. So that combination it causes and perpetuates poverty, racism, and sexism. So if we say, well, let's stop this, our normal change process is, well, that's the problem, gross inequality. Let's go after, have a strategy, a gap analysis to go after basics for all. We will experience resistance to that effort, even amongst people who believe we need to move that direction. That resistance will come from people who have a value of abundance for some and a fear of losing it. And so that leads to that downside. So that's the fear process that gets in the way. But what can we do? We can supplement or think with and thinking as an essential element to interrupt sexism, racism, and poverty in all contexts. So what we can do is we can solve problems, we can hold on to or thinking in order to solve problems, and we can embrace and thinking so that polarities get leveraged. Now we can bring and thinking to claiming power, and we can share power to protect their interests. So we can go after freedom in order to have abundance for some, and we can go after equality and provide basics for all. We can go after justice, in which we have accountability and belong, and we can go after mercy and forgiveness. And so that leads to an interruption of poverty, racism, and sexism. So by the way, it's not an accident that the four poles on the left tend to be masculine poles, and the four poles on the right tend to be feminine. So open to questions and answers. I'll stop sharing, and we can see what your thoughts are about this. So you can put things in the chat, and maybe Steve, if you would look in the chat if anything's coming in there, and share stuff that's coming in there. But individually, just stop. You can just take yourself off mute and ask the question directly also.
So when you started off with the or dilemma and needing the and, my mind automatically went to De Bono's lateral thinking. Mm-hmm. Where we try to organize by categorizing, we try to simplify things, and it feels like this concept of needing the or and the and is a way of bringing to the table a little bit more and getting people just to stretch their minds just a little bit more. Is that where this is all coming from, or?
Yes, well, it didn't come from him, but it parallels. So there's a lot there's a lot of work out there, and there's called, paradox or dilemma. as well as polarity, a lot written about the interdependent pair and interdependency in the world. And so what we're bringing is a map and a set of principles to suggest how this interdependency works. And it overlaps significantly with a lot of other great writing and insights. Yeah.
Yeah, I love the way that you laid out the, the different levels with the getting down to the root cause. Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Other questions or insights?
Hi, I'm still trying to digest because this was a lot to take in.
Yes.
But I'm finding some parallels myself between the Gestalt courses that I just finished and the IThou thinking being on a continuum, and kind of seeing the IThou within this polarity and wondering if was that intentional? Or
Yes, as a matter of fact, in Buber's first writing about I and thou, he talks about the world of I, thou, and I, it. And that is a polarity. And it's not on a continuum in the sense we often think about a continuum that slides back and forth. It is more two variables that are interdependent. And so for example, inhaling and exhaling is not on a continuum. You inhale and you exhale. You don't try to get some point in the middle between inhaling and exhaling because it's not sustainable. You actually are moving, oscillating between those two. The energy moves through these. And so the normal notion of, well, let's do a compromise in the middle of something does not work with polarities. With polarities, you have to intentionally empower both poles over time. Now, you can be paying attention to both poles, but the energy will move. And it will move moment to moment, but it will also move decade to decade in organizations. I don't want to talk too long about one thing, so let me go back to other questions. By the way, one other thing about the I-thou. The last chapter of the book, I talk about the whole first 33 chapters of the book are in the I-it world. The I-thou world is the world in which differentiation disappears, and we appreciate universal oneness, and that's I think a profound point that Buber's bringing.
thank you. Yeah, your book is on my nightstand for reading between the holidays, so I look forward to that.
Yeah, good.
Barry,
yeah.
Barry, I think Nicole's question is really significant in terms of the relationship to the Gestalt course, because many of the DODC students took that course with Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a background of what came first, Gestalt or polarities in your life.
Yeah, so I got my training in Gestalt in 1973 to 1975 at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland. And so what I was struck by with Gestalt was, that's where I first learned about the notion of paradoxical change. And then the first polarity map emerged as I was working as a Gestalt therapist, one-on-one with a client, in which we moved around in between the two chairs that we represented. So we physically moved and created the first polarity map. That was in 1975. And what I discovered is I thought this is a way to show how paradoxical change works. So if you put the Gestalt notion of paradoxical change on a polarity map, you'd say the quickest way to move from the pole you're on to the pole you want to embrace is to first embrace the pole you're on. So if you want to move from stability to change, you need to first embrace stability and then add change. So we call that the getting unstuck process. So thanks for that check, Carol. Other questions or insights?
There's a question in the chat, Barry.
Okay.
Do you want me to read it, or do you want to read it?
Go ahead and read it.
Barry, do you think polarity and your assessment tool could be applied to assessment in areas like matching mentor and mentee, particularly cross-gender relationships, touches on sexism issues, and also with strategic partnerships, bringing two different internal groups or external partners, maybe former competitors, forming an alliance and/or is key for success in many of these relationships. It seems it would be great for driving awareness of issues like racism across a team or organization to better understand each other and/or their evolving customer bases.
Yes, I think that it has application in all those areas inquired about. And one of the things that is helpful about it is that when we're dealing with sexism and racism, we deal with those first. Most people are familiar with unconscious bias in terms of sexism and racism that we absorb from being in the culture. There is also an unconscious or thinking bias that is stacked on top of that, the sexism and racism in the culture. And it's also a cultural bias about problem solving and or thinking. And so it's very helpful to be aware that the resistance, for example, the resistance to having basic housing for everyone, the resistance to basic housing for everyone can be a combination of racism and either or thinking. And the or thinking, there's an unconscious bias that people would have that if we're going to provide basic housing for everyone, I at a gut level assume I can't keep my really nice house. I can't have abundance and have them have basics because I got to choose. And so the assumption is, the fear is like the downside of socialism. Well, everybody's going to have to live in the same house with the same amount of money, devoted to their living residence, because that's where you're headed. And so I'm going to have to give up my house if I'm serious about providing basic housing for everyone. I'm suggesting that's an or mindset, unconscious or mindset, that causes resistance to really implementing the desire to move towards basic housing for everyone. And unless you are explicit about that unconscious possible bias and say, wait a minute, let's look at this. Is it possible for us to have abundance for some and basics for all? We're talking about, whether we're talking about healthcare, education, whatever it is, if you can make it explicit rather than have it be a subterfuge that's underneath, then you've got a better chance of addressing it. It's not dismissing the unconscious bias in terms of sexism or racism, but it's saying there's more here than that. And if you don't pay attention to that, then you are really undermining your efforts to gain what you're wanting to gain in any of the categories that I listed, food, water, healthcare, safety. So, other questions or insights?
I have another one if nobody else does.
Nicole?
Michelle, go ahead.
Go ahead, good. You were reading one or?
No, I was going to ask one. Nicole, go first.
I don't want to monopolize your time, but what you're saying is now starting to connect some dots for me. In reading Ibram Kendi's book about how to be anti-racist, he makes a statement in there that says that racism and capitalism are inexplicably joined. They're conjoined twins. And I was really struggling with that this week, trying to figure out what that meant.
Yeah.
And your paradox here is kind of like helping to untangle that a little bit. One of the things that they criticism of Kendi, though, is that he does not attack really systemic racism. And so I don't know if do you want to can you talk a little bit about how those two kind of intertwine in your model?
Well, I think that the way they intertwine is, and you're right on in my estimation, Nicole, what you're saying, and that is that if you look at those four polarities that I identified, the or thinking at the top is really fundamental. You bring or thinking to the other three, you're in trouble. Now, another key polarity is individual racism and sexism, and systemic institutional racism and sexism. They're built in the laws, etc. That's another polarity. You have to pay attention to both. What's clear, though, is that it's human beings that created those systems. And so what was the mindset that created the systems that we are now judging? And so you need to go back to, well, they didn't come out of thin air. They came out of actually an or mindset about those issues I was talking about, an or mindset about or and, that unconscious mindset, and then you get right into the power issue. And it's like, it's no accident, for example, that the United States, in the name of serving and protecting, and I've done a lot of work with the US military, in the name of serving and protecting, we spend more money on our military in the United States than the next 8 countries' military budgets combined. Now, why all that money towards that end? Because the argument has been made that we want to serve and protect, and it's many people have the either or mindset about power, which is we need to claim power over in order to make sure that nobody can harm us. So that power as a deterrent becomes a claiming of power without sharing power, which leads to an abuse of power. And so that abuse of power is that systemic process, right? So you write the laws. You have the power to write the laws. Now you write the laws. It says, for example, you can't teach slaves to read. Why? Because reading is an empowering act. And you can't be sharing power. If you can't, you can't share power if you have an either or mindset towards power. So if we do not address the either or mindset towards power, you'll just have a different way. You can have a whole civil war, and after the civil war, you figure out other ways to claim power without sharing it. You have Jim Crow laws that don't allow people the right to vote. Why? Because if they had the right to vote, you'd be sharing power through the vote. So you figure out ways to not share power in terms of voting. Still happening today in all the states that are trying to diminish access to voting, primarily against people who are marginalized. All right. So that's the mindset is the same. I can't claim power and share power, so I will claim power. I will figure out a way to do it. Until that mindset shifts, the continual effort will be how to claim power without sharing it.
Thank you. Thank you.
So Barry, my inquiry is based on Michelle, who's our methods expert, and
Yeah.
asked you about the validity of the instrument or the items in the instrument. And what this says to me is that several students might in fact be interested in using this as a method within their dissertations. And I'd like to know if anybody in the Polarity community has done a dissertation using the assessment, or what's the experience in terms of traditional doctorate programs or this one, which is action research?
Yes, some have used assessment in their doctorates. There are a number of students at Walden University who have used it. I think there's like over 20 of them, and they're in different parts of the world. They've used a polarity assessment in relation to their doctorates. They're the university that have used it most. And the Institute for Polarities of Democracy that operates in conjunction with Walden University is one place where that's done. There are also students who have done it at other universities with us. I haven't paid much attention to it myself in terms of monitoring it. We have other people who teach people the basics in our assessments to support them in doing it, so they would know. Cliff would know for sure. But there are students who have been using it in the United States and around the world. Cliff just got back from working with a group of people from Brie in Brazil just last 2 weeks ago. So yeah, so it's out there and it is being used by graduate students. The simple answer.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll bite. Can you give an example of how this can be applied in an organization? I mean, you've shown kind of the background. How do we use this?
Okay, sure.
Like your
So,
doctor, how did they use it?
They used it to assess the polarities they were focusing on. There are 5 polarities that are written up as polarities of democracy that have been written up. It's in the chapter in volume 2 of our book, and they would look at one or more key polarities, and then they would see, because they're helping organizations deal with organizational polarities, as well as helping communities look at polarities that they would have. One of the places that we have used it in is in police community relations. The place where we have used it in police community relations is in Charleston, especially in Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the key polarities there was what we called engagement and enforcement. So how effectively is the, and you can assess this at the community level. What is the community doing to support enforcement and engagement? And what is the police force doing to support enforcement and engagement? And then you can assess that. And so when I was talking with, as a part of our work at Cincinnati, we got quite a ways down the road in exploring this with the police department of Cincinnati before the chief of police was fired. And so our efforts went with him when he ended up being fired. But in our discussion, what we were looking at was one key polarity they especially wanted to measure, and they wanted to assess it in the whole community of Cincinnati. And so what we had set up was, it was going to be enforcement and engagement. And the demographics, we're going to break it down by neighborhoods, by all the neighborhoods in Cincinnati. And we were going to have everybody would be able to go. We were going to advertise it on community stations, et cetera, that you could just go to this number and you could fill out your own demographics and do the assessment. So you get this community assessment, and we were going to intentionally go to neighborhoods where people might not have any internet, and we're going to go to churches and other organizations, mosques, et cetera, and have people interview people to get their answers, so we have good involvement in terms of involving key stakeholders. You didn't have to have any sort of electronic connection with a computer or whatever to do it. We were going to have people doing that and entering it, and then we could check and see what was the difference in people's perception by neighborhood. So in higher income neighborhoods, blue collar neighborhoods, low income neighborhoods, what was their perception of how well the police were managing the engagement and enforcement, and how well was the community handling enforcement engagement? Because this is seen as not just the police responsibility, but it's the community's responsibility. What is the community doing, to support leveraging this polarity? So those are the kind of things that we have worked on. We are now in an effort. We're in conversations with a couple of communities in which we're hoping to do something like that with them. It's called the Bridge Project, so we're working on doing that, having discussions about it. Yeah, so there are, and when we do them, by the way, we encourage people to do more than one. So they do a baseline, and then they do one, they define the frequency with which they want to do it. And then they do it on a regular basis, because you're monitoring how effective are we, and then you can continually look at our action steps and early warnings that we generated originally. How are we doing now, and what else might we want to do? And so we did an assessment with the medical school at the University of Cincinnati, and they broke it down by departments and all of that, and we started that. They're doing that on an annual basis now, We started that a few years ago, and they're continuing to monitor how effectively they are dealing with, I think it is 4 key polarities that they identified. So they're driven by the community. It's really a bottom-up process in terms of, okay, what are the issues? What might be the polarities? Which ones are most important? Okay, how would we map them? So that's the one end. We also have, a list of, I mean, we've done this actually probably hundreds of times now. So we've got a whole list also of polarity assessments that we have done. So you can go there and look at one and modify it so it fits your organization if you want to. That's another option.
Barry, I just wanted to offer one thing this is really the design challenge for people doing organization development and change work. And the principle of the polarity, going back to the Gestalt, gives a person, a system, an opportunity to notice and to make explicit that noticing. So there's lots of tools we can use if and you can creatively find ways to take the polarity map and help a person or a group to come to some more conscious collective agreement around the polarity. And we can use different tools, right? You can put a map up on the wall, and you could have groups go up and put stickers up on the wall, the polarities, and then you could have small groups kind of organize them into themes, and then as a group reflect back out to each other and come to a collective agreement about that. You could have them take it one step further and put little green dots next to the most important ones, or the ones they do well, and reds next to the ones they don't do so well, right? So you can take the tool and you can creatively integrate it with other dialogue or other group sense-making techniques. And but at the essence of it, it's about making the noticing explicit and concise. And I think you said it really well, Nicole. It's to untangle and to create some more objectivity, which I think that in and of itself, at the premise, is that once the group or person notices this, they will be wise enough to know what to do next. And then once they're wise enough, you can use other tools such as prioritization of actions to take, and then good project management and tracking and other kinds of things that follow on to that.
Absolutely, Steve. Great points, all of them. Absolutely. And just to build on that, Steve, the other thing that is really wonderful to do, and this again comes out of the Gestalt background, is to physically move through the polarity map by having it on the floor. And so you can take people as a group. For example, I've done this often, actually, whenever I have a chance. I just did it at the University of Alabama 3 weeks ago at their business school. There were about 40 people, and we moved physically from one space in the map to the other, and they collectively generate content. And they end up, we're almost out of time, but anyway, you can do that. Have we got a couple more minutes? I just want to share with you one thing that I did in relation to that. Can we go a little bit long? Is that okay?
We want to stay as close as we can, but I think it'd be great to wrap up with this example. And
Okay.
Again,
Great.
we're not done with having you part of what we're doing, Barry. So this is not the end. This is the beginning of a lot more conversation.
So I was at Harvard at LILA, the Learning Innovations Lab at Harvard, and there were 50 people in the room from 30 some organizations in the United States and outside, big organizations like Google, other large organizations. And we got on a polarity map around complex adaptive systems. And they talked about administrative leadership and entrepreneurial leadership. And what we did was we physically moved, all of us, through the map and generated what's the upside of administrative, what's the upside of entrepreneurial, and the downsides. And we walked through and generated the content. Then I asked all of them, okay, where would you put yourself, your organization, in these quadrants? You know, where would you be on this flow? And every one of them, every person, all 35 organizations there were in the lower left quadrant, which was the downside of administrative, wanting to go to the upside of entrepreneurial. All organizations start in the upside of entrepreneurial, so they take off, but they experience the limits of entrepreneurial alone They get in the downside of entrepreneurial and they go back to claim the administrative side, right? The centralized, coordinated. But the problem is all the leaders become the administrative types. And you find yourself in the downside of administrative wanting to go back to entrepreneurial. And the resistance is huge because of the or mindset. And that's why all of them, it's no accident, all of them just agreed. That's why they came to LILA, the Learning Innovations Lab, because they wanted to re-stimulate innovation in their organizations. In the organization's life cycle, they were caught on the downside of administrative. So anyway, that's something you can do. And physically, people get it really well when you physically move around. So thanks for letting me have a little time there, Steve.
Oh, no, it's wonderful. I think we got the polarity of wanting more time with you and having to work within the time we have. So it's great. Thank you for your time. This is wonderful work that you're doing, and your commitment, your sustained commitment to bringing this work to the world in very impactful and important ways. It's a real blessing. So thank you for sticking with it, as I would say, because thought leadership is one of the hallmarks of our program, and thought leadership at the core is creating knowledge and disseminating or scaling it so that you can make a difference while you sleep.
Yeah.
Perfect example is Nicole is going to be reading over the break. She's got your book on her nightstand. She's going to have a chance to read it, and you might be having a nap while she's reading it. You're making a difference in her life while she's reading. Thought leadership, I also think of it like the great recipe. A person with a master's degree will be great at taking recipes and using them and applying them. But as we move into the doctoral level in thought leadership, like you have, and you create recipes that get disseminated, get used, get duplicated. You create your recipe, people make copies and share it with others. And so your ability to create something that's accessible, to write it up, to create workshops, to put it out there, to build a community around your work, those are all the hallmarks of great thought leadership. So you're a role model that I hope our students can learn from, and not only in content, but in the person that you are. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.